KPBS On Demand is supported by Splatero, helping homeowners pay for home improvements by offering streamlined access to your home's equity with no additional monthly payments or new debt. Splatero provides a lump sum payment in exchange for a share of your home's future value. Pre-qualification available at splatero.com.
Welcome to another edition of listener-supported KPBS Cinema Junkie podcast. I'm Beth Accomando. Let's face it, found footage has become a tired trope in horror. But those films all manufacture their supposed found footage. That kind of fakery holds no interest for experimental filmmaker Bill Morrison. He's interested in the real deal, genuine footage that has been unearthed, uncovered, or just waiting to be found and brought to light.
What interests me is that this is the flotsam and jetsam of time, that is that we see on the frame. They've washed up on our shores now. That's what I find really remarkable, is how time is evinced in these old footage. And the image underneath is just one layer, and everything that's happened to it since it was shot is another layer or several layers.
At a time when everyone seems to be using digital technology to clean up old images, Morrison revels in the decay and damage he finds in old archival footage. He doesn't see this as marring the original image so much as altering it to create something new. Or maybe as altering it so that we have to explore, like digging through layers of sedimentary rock to find evidence of something that came before. But his exploration has some intoxicating and mind-altering side effects.
Well, I'm aware of the effect, and that's why I call my production company Hypnotic Pictures. I think you're trying to find an image underneath those flickering layers. Somehow those flickering layers are massaging your brain in a way that you're not aware of, and you do get into some kind of altered state with that.
His new documentary is Dawson City, Frozen Time, which uses hundreds of nitrate films from the early 1900s that were discovered in the permafrost of the Yukon Territories in Canada. I missed the opportunity to see Dawson City at the TCM Classic Film Festival in April because, ironically, I was filing a story for NPR about the projection booth at the festival being upgraded to show nitrate prints. But the film looked so deliciously tempting that I had to get it for our Digital Gym Cinema here in San Diego. I also wanted to talk to the man who made this unique and absolutely genuine found footage film. Morrison is both a documentary and experimental filmmaker who works with found footage that he repurposes to tell new stories. He believes in the spellbinding quality of those found images and creates films that are cinematic poems. In one of his early films, Decassia, he uses decaying archival footage to create a creepy and haunting meditation about the transient nature of all things. And some of those images are more nightmare-inducing than most horror films. In The Great Flood, he uses silent film images to recount the story of the Mississippi River flood of 1927. And in The Miner's Hymn, he also employs archival materials to look at the ill-fated mining towns of northeast England. The seeds for Dawson City, Frozen Time were sown years ago when Morrison first heard tales of a cache of films found in a swimming pool in Canada. Initially, he thought it was just a myth that wouldn't die. But in 2013, he met Paul Gordon, who does digital migration for the Library and Archives Canada, and found out that they were getting a 4K digital scanner to import the Dawson City collection. Suddenly, the myth was turning into reality, and the timing seemed perfect to start thinking about how to turn that footage into a film.
This is fascinating. These are World Series shots from 1917 and 1919. And Canada, just getting a hold of these videos is fascinating, huh?
It was an incredible story.
His documentary looks to both the history of cinema and the history of Dawson City itself, which boomed during the Yukon Gold Rush at the end of the 1800s.
And it became the Paris of the North. It was a rollicking gold rush town that had caviar and champagne and had electric lights before any other town in Western Canada. Overnight, the largest city in Canada west of Winnipeg, whereas, again, 2 years before, there had just been some moose there and some reindeers. Of course, there was a lot of money, and a lot of the people who were working, and the other people were kind of grifting, and there was a lot of idle time, and entertainers came through there to mind the miners, as everyone was trying to do. And these theaters were also housed, itinerant showmen and eventually movie projectionists who would come with their movie projectors and their limited library of films. And over the years, after the Stampeders, as they were called, moved on to Nome or to other places, maybe Hollywood, the town was left as sort of a functioning mining town of maybe 1,000 or 2,000 people. Those theaters remained and became the endpoint of a silent film distribution chain. And it was too expensive to ship them back. Of course, nobody had the same historical value for films that we have today. They were considered sort of like old newspapers or comic strips, even the comic pages. No distributor wanted to pay to have them back. No studio cared about having them back, and they were told just to dispose of them. So the way to do that was the easiest, was to throw them in the Yukon River. And I think many, many, many thousands of films were thrown into the Yukon River. Some were burned in controlled nitrate bonfires. Those were very hot and dangerous. And some were inadvertently ignited just through spontaneous combustion or improper handling. But there was a certain cache that accumulated in the basement of the Carnegie Library there in town in Dawson City, a library which actually had suffered its own fire and was now vacated. And as the local bank came to control the film while it was in Dawson, it was the agent for the studios, and all these films started to accumulate into the basement of the Carnegie Library until there wasn't any room for them there either. And at that point, kind of an amazing convergence happened where the local hockey rink, which had always suffered from being in the winter a hockey rink and in the summer this swimming pool, because of that, it always had sort of an uneven surface on the ice. There was always a bulge where the hollow swimming pool was underneath. And the Hockey League decided to fill in the swimming pool in 1929. And the treasurer of the Hockey League was also the bank manager, a guy named Clifford Thompson. And he arranged to have after writing the distributors and saying, "Do you want these back?" And they all said no. Then he arranged to have all these hundreds of reels of film carted into the dry swimming pool and then covered with earth and then covered with planks and then iced over. And for once in the town's history, they had a nice flat ice skating rink, and everyone forgot about it for the most part. I mean, there was accounts of the film somehow working their way up through the ice during certain thaws, and the kids knew that they were down there, but by and large, people forgot about this huge nitrate film dump that was underneath the hockey rink until 1978, when a construction project was going on to rebuild or build a new recreation center, and the backhoe was working its way through those planks and uncovered this enormous cache of 35-millimeter nitrate film. And before too long, a deal was struck with the National Film Archives in Canada to restore 533 35-millimeter nitrate film reels, which represented 372 titles, which all were unique. All of the other copies that existed elsewhere in the world had either been thrown out or gone up in fires or decayed beyond recognition. And these 533 reels were the only things that remained of these titles. And they were restored in 1978 and 1979. Between the United States Library of Congress and the Canadian National Archives, now known as Library and Archives Canada, they each received copies of these films, and they made duplicates for each other. They have sat in storage for 38 years, and to the best of my knowledge, not too many people have looked at them since then.
So it's amazing that they could have actually restored some of these films to the point where you could watch them. I mean, if they've been buried for that long, it attests to how durable that film stock must have been.
The film stock was durable. It also inadvertently was a really perfect storage medium for them because it was ice cold. It was permafrost, 12 months out of the year, and there was no oxygen. It was dark and cold, and so these films actually probably looked pretty good had they been exhumed by professionals and immediately restored back in the summer of '78. They could look very different than they do today. But the situation was such that they were being taken out into a hot summer afternoon, and the change in temperature and the change in humidity meant that and emulsion was really dripping off the base. And they were being handled by amateurs, not to say they were being handled badly, but they were in the process of identifying which these reels were, which was instrumental for them to receive the funding to restore them. But nonetheless, what should have been done was they should have been just encased in some plastic and and then soaked immediately and then professionally rewashed and dried and stabilized. That didn't happen until November of that year when the pros in Ottawa received a big Hercules air transport of these films, and again, the difference in temperature and humidity was such that they were extremely fragile. Because of the preservation work, they developed a technique whereby putting it through a photo flow solution and rewashing these films, they were able to stabilize them. But the Dawson City collection is very unique in how it looks. Most old nitrate film collections show an extraordinary amount of nitrate film decay. That's not the case with this collection. This collection shows almost universally water damage to the sides of the reels. The side on either side of the frame, you see these white, spindly-like fingers reaching towards the middle of the frame, and that is known in archive circles as Dawson flutter because it's unique to how this collection was discovered and handled.
So for people who may not be familiar, I did a podcast talking about nitrate film, but if people didn't listen to that or don't know what it is, nitrate was the film stock that was originally created, and it's a highly unstable, but in your film, you kind of go into the process of making nitrate. So explain a little bit about kind of what nitrate is and why it has a certain kind of romance to it.
Tagline of my film is film was born of an explosive. And nitrate film, when nitrocellulose is gun cotton. It was developed as an explosive. You would take some cotton and combine it with nitric acid and sulfuric acid, and you'd have this thing that once it dried, when lit, it burned very quickly and entirely. You think of like flash powder, that's what this is. And it wasn't until camphor was added to this explosive that was used in military warheads all through the 19th century that the first plastic was developed. And that first plastic was the base of film. It was what we call nitrate film. So really the vehicle, if you will, the thing that transports our entire cinematic history from the very, very beginning, from 1894 until 1950, is an explosive. It's an explosive medium. And it was more flexible and more durable than anything they could come up with in the ensuing, whatever that is, 58 years. So even though there was a safety base that was developed as early as 1910, it was strictly the domain of amateur films because it couldn't handle the heavy distribution that the nitrate films could and maintain its flexibility. Despite the fact that very quickly people realized that you were going to have a lot of loss of life and a lot of loss of film collections, they still embraced nitrate film as a medium for our entire film history, and that is why we have very little of it left. No one can be quite sure, but the number is put sometimes at 75% of our silent film history has been lost. So we have basically a quarter of what was made left, and I wouldn't be surprised if that number was actually quite a bit less than that. But at any rate, it's an amazing medium. I love it. And what it does do, besides bursting into flames, and that's what it's most famous for and sort of most, as you say, romanticized for, is that people think anytime you look at it, it's just going to explode. Actually, the case is more that it off-gases, and then it's stored in tight containers, and that gas forms pressure to the point that if there was a spark, then you'd have an explosion. And once this stuff catches on fire, all of it burns in its entirety, even submerged underwater. It's just that flammable. But I've played around a lot with this stuff. I regularly go down at least once a year to the nitrate vaults of the Library of Congress, where they put aside some of the reels that they're going to throw away, and I'm sort of the last stop for these reels. They figure if I don't want them, then nobody wants them. So there's oftentimes a collection of ossifying reels of nitrate film and a little Post-it sticker with my name on it, designating them for my last approval. So it's a lot of my career has been formed from making art from these nitrate reels. But in the case of Dawson City, that's a very different type of decay. What you're seeing, as opposed to nitrate decay, is you're seeing a lot of water damage on the side of the frames. So it's a different type of decay.
And you actually have footage of like nitrate film being made back in the day, and I'd never seen anything like that. That was really fascinating to see that.
Oh, yeah. Well, there's a film, I believe Columbia Pictures made called Romance of Celluloid, and it's part of their whole Romance of series of educational films. Yeah, actually, as I edited it quite pointedly, because it starts with sharecroppers harvesting cotton, and then that cotton becomes film, and eventually you end up with beautiful movie stars on the film. So that particular film needed quite a bit of editorializing in order to be made appropriate for my film.
Your film takes a unique approach to kind of the documentary format. Most people think of documentary, we're going to get talking heads, or we're going to get, people being interviewed. And you set up some of the information like that. But for the most part, your film is kind of this fever dream of memories of these old silent films. So how did you want to take all these clips and put them together? I mean, when you first kind of decided to do this, what were you thinking your approach was going to be? And how did that change as you kind of started to assemble this?
Oh, well, my approach was always to make the fever dream. People who are familiar with my work were quite stunned to see talking heads and a baseball show beginning my film. They're like, what the hell is going on with this guy? He's sold out, But it becomes very clear within 5 or 10 minutes that you're back in the same type of editing rhythm that you're accustomed to with my earlier work. I always thought that this was a film that was going to have a lot of lyricism to it. And between the Heggs photographs and the nitrate that was buried in the swimming pool, and the paper print collection from the time, and the archival footage that supports the area, there was just going to be an abundance of footage, and that I would troll through the century, with every decade being represented in some way by footage, and tell the story of the American century through this divining rod of this film collection.
And because most of this film, or all of it, was silent, there's no soundtrack that comes with the movie. So where did you get the music from, and how did you create kind of the soundscape that went with these images?
Well, I worked very closely with a composer named Alex Summers. People might be familiar with his work if you saw the film Captain Fantastic last year. He did that soundtrack as well. But I came to him through the band Sigur Rós, which the Icelandic band that he's closely associated with, and has produced with them for many years. And so he was familiar with my work, and we met backstage at a Sigur Rós concert in Ottawa, maybe in 2014. And a few weeks after that, I had him up to my apartment in New York, and I showed him the films. And he had the idea of bringing his brother John Summers in to do sound design, and the two of them worked very closely to create a sound design that would dovetail with the soundtrack and would sort of enhance it and also be a counterpoint to it while supporting the images. So between the two of them, they really created some a different world, which is really what I wanted, was to not mimic old silent movies, but to create sort of this fantastic voyage that would take the viewer on.
Well, it was fabulous because it really does have this kind of, like, you're watching it and you feel like you're in some sort of drug-induced state. You get completely taken away.
What's nice is that you can still drive home.
In assembling it, how much footage were you going through to kind of pare it down to this?
I'd say all told, there's, I think, 500,000 feet, which would be around 100 hours of footage. I certainly looked at all the newsreels, and I didn't look at all the fiction films, but I looked at a lot of them, and I was able to kind of gather them based on their what descriptions were available of them, and I could sort of run searches based on keywords that I needed for my narrative, and in this way I started to accumulate a sort of a stock library of this footage on various hard drives. Dawson City is a fairly well-mediated town from its very inception. So, again, we had this paper print collection spanning all the way back to, the very beginning of cinema, or at least the first couple of years. The ship leaving for the gold rush, loading horses for the Klondike. There's the summer of 1897 out of Seattle. And then following the stampeders up to Dawson City, there's footage, in the mines and on Front Street, incredibly. So that's sort of the very beginning of cinema, and then, of course, the Spanish-American War was going on, and footage of that war was a huge draw in theaters there, and you can work your way through to where the film started arriving in 1907, and they were showing sort of a depiction of what was going on. The reality films were showing what was going on elsewhere in the world, and then as newsreels came in 1911, sort of the labor conditions and the type of labor issues that would interest the common moviegoer, to be a worker. And in that way, I was able to start piecing together these different decades that each gave a unique portrait of the 20th century, and also specifically of the Americans' role in the 20th century. So all through the century, Dawson City always saw itself as sort of this mythologized town through the lens of the gold rush, and it always was looking back at the gold rush and comparing itself to how it used to be, and responding to the outside world image of it as a gold rush town, and first as a real rough town, and then as a rich town, and then as a sort of forgotten town. And there was footage that supported that for every decade of the century. And so as I started my research, and I just came upon more and more footage that sort of rhymed with the entire narrative arc of the birth and death of this town, and indeed the birth and death of our country.
So in going through all this footage, was there anything that really surprised you, or anything that you kind of just fell in love with based on, what you had seen before, and that it was different?
There's quite a bit that surprised me, and there was an enormous amount I fell in love with. Every shot in there is a shot that I've fallen in love with in some way or the other, because there's so much that I wasn't able to include. If anyone's been following this film over the past couple of years, it made a splash in 2014 when I found footage of the 1919 World Series, and that's the famed Black Sox scandal World Series, in which shoeless Joe Jackson and his teammates on the Chicago White Sox accepted bribes to throw the 1919 World Series to the Cincinnati Reds. What was remarkable about it is that this particular newsreel devoted almost half of its running time to this World Series, not knowing that it was depicting a notorious or criminal sporting event. It was just depicting the news, as it were, and one of the innings that it happened to not only photograph but also include as part of its edit within the newsreel showed purportedly one of the plays that had been circled in testimony in the court hearings that showed the White Sox failing to make what would have been a routine double play. So it's sort of a smoking gun footage that astounded the baseball world. And So that was rather amusing because I had to keep explaining to people that I wasn't actually making a baseball movie. I was just making a movie about a fascinating collection of which this baseball footage was proof of how fascinating it was. Because if you can find something like that on the very first day, well, there must be a lot of other stuff buried there too. And indeed, there was. I mean, there was a lot of newsreel stuff that I just found intriguing, especially because it really all happened 100 years ago from now. So if you look at the summer of 1917, a lot of people are starting to go off to war and, are mobilizing. And you have the Great Migration of African Americans taking place and fulfilling those jobs in the North. And there's just an enormous amount of racial tension. There's a lot of mob violence against African Americans and lynchings. And then there was this incredible parade that was photographed on Fifth Avenue, the Silent Parade, organized by W.E.B. Du Bois on July 28, 1917, in which thousands of African Americans staged the first civil rights protest in New York, and really maybe the second in the country, walking down Fifth Avenue, carrying signs, wearing white clothes, and being completely silent. It's called the Silent Parade. So that was a remarkable newsreel find. The same year, a few months later, 12,000 women protest, for voting rights. And so this was a great suffragist parade that happened only 3 or 4 months after the Silent Parade, and that was instrumental in for women to gain voting rights. So there's a lot of things like that. There was obviously I couldn't include all this stuff. I did include that in my film. There was a lot of stuff I couldn't include in my film. I couldn't include the incredible bloody summer of 1919 and the race riots, and I couldn't include all the incredible scientific discoveries that are depicted. And but anyone who's interested in what was happening exactly 100 years ago, well, this is a very timely collection to take a deeper look into.
Did you come to this with a lot of knowledge and love of history as well, or did you kind of get into that as you started researching the footage you were finding?
Well, I did come with a lot of love of history. I've made 2 documentary films that are historical documents, one about the coal miners specifically in northern England, called The Miners' Hymns, and then more recently a film about the 1927 flood, which was another chapter of the Great Migration, called The Great Flood. And those 2 films really prepared me for this massive story, which, even though it tells sort of the humble story of the loss and recovery of a film collection, that's just the template to tell a bigger story about the rise and fall of our country.
We've talked mostly about the newsreel footage. What about some of the films, like the Hollywood films and things like that? Were there any ones that had actors or performers that we don't have much footage of them because it's been lost? Were there any things there that you found that you were really happy to have uncovered?
It is a remarkable collection, and that a lot of these there are some well-known stars. There's Harold Lloyd, and there's Fatty Arbuckle, and there's Lionel Barrymore, and Pearl Dare, and there's a number of sort of household name actors. But it's not the point of the film to dwell on those. That might be for another film historian to take that on. I was more interested in how to use those narrative films to tell the story. There are remarkable coincidences throughout it all. One of them being that there's many expositional tropes that happen in silent film that are repeated throughout the whole genre. So you'll have people opening doors and closing doors, or listening at doors, or writing letters, or talking on the phone. And this is a way of advancing the plot. And by taking all this footage as a whole, I started to go through it and, make sequences that had, that either had like images or like actions, and these became sort of my stock library with which I could tell the larger story.
And now that the film's finished, what kind of a response has it been getting? Have you been surprised by any of the reception, or just like what kind of feedback are you getting?
The response has been very good. I think people are really surprised by the film. They're surprised that it's a true story that seems to take all these twists and turns. It kind of has a Dickensian quality in that you meet characters early on in the film, and then they come back, and you think you're being overloaded with too much detail, but then those details come back in the second half of the film to support a larger story. And so I think a lot of people, find that remarkable. There's a lot that hasn't been explored in this collection. I feel like in some ways this film is the first real effort to try to understand the breadth of what this collection holds. One of the really remarkable shots that are in it is the Solax film factory on fire. Part of what's remarkable about that is that this footage of the Solax film factory catching on fire, it's a nitrate film fire, was buried in a swimming pool underneath which a movie theater was burned down from a nitrate film fire. So it was protected from a nitrate film fire happening a few feet above it, while it was buried in the permafrost for 50 years. And that happened to be the studio of Alice Guy Blanchet, singular force in narrative film development. A lot of people don't know her name, but she really invented narrative film as a storytelling art. Before that, it was sort of it came out of the vaudevillian form, and she understood that these images could also tell stories. And Alice Guy made 1,000 titles until that film factory fire basically wiped out her career at age 47. So really an amazing person, and to find this extraordinary footage of her factory on fire, footage that had survived and being underneath another nitrate film fire, I think is just incredibly ironic. But there's other female directors who are represented in the collection as well, including Ida Mae Park and Lynn Reynolds and Lois Weber, all of whom were directors in the silent era. So it's pretty extraordinary to think that the fledgling art of cinema was open to anybody who could make sense of it. And these young geniuses were quick to take the reins, coming out of a literary background, and are, we are much indebted to them for shaping what we know of as narrative and fiction film today.
Hollywood has recently made a lot of these fictional found footage films, where mostly horror, but where you find footage and then it's cut into these movies. Your film is like the real thing. Like, this is really a found footage film. What is it about that kind of a format that attracts you and that you enjoy working in?
Well, I come out of painting and the plastic arts, so I come to film as a collage art. And I'm interested in seeing the evidence that it's a physical medium, and that each one of its pictures are single plastic static pictures that have the illusion of motion. So I've always been compelled by that idea that we're looking at a number of pictures passing by, and anything that betrays that and gives that evidence that that's what you're looking at, I've always been attracted to. I don't know how that genre that you're describing got to be called found footage, because they've appropriated a name that has it's not found footage. First of all, it's not even footage, and it's not found, it's created. So it's sort of a gimmick or something, and I don't know how they've used that word, but they have. Anyway, this is footage that has been found quite literally, and to my mind, that term always applies to archival footage.
Do you have another project lined up at this point?
Oh, yeah. Well, I have a big stock drawer, and there's always different projects that I want to work on. But one came to me while I was working on this one, in that last summer, I don't know if you remember, but a fisherman pulled a lobster trap out of the sea 20 miles off the coast of Iceland, and inside that lobster trap was a Russian film from 1969. And when they unspooled that film, they figured out who the actor and director was, and he was actually a guy who had a long history as a Soviet film actor and later a director. So I'm exploring his story and how it related to the Soviet century. And so if Dawson City is my exploration of capitalism's relationship to silent cinema, this one will be my the relationship of communism to silent cinema.
Well, I want to thank you very much for your time. I really enjoyed your film. It was just such an amazing experience, and we're going to be showing it here in San Diego, so I'm very excited to be able to show it to people on a big screen.
Yeah, it'll be at the Digital Gym there, and concurrently we'll run at the New Art in Los Angeles. So if you can get to either theater, you have your choice. And
it's still, you still have plans to show it at other venues as they keep coming up, correct?
That's right. If you check the Kino Lorber website, it'll be coming to a theater near you. We're very encouraged by our opening weekend, so hopefully we'll get it to as many towns as possible. And
what was the screening like at the Turner Classic Movie Festival?
Oh, it was fantastic. In Turner Classic Movies, what happens is the movie starts, and whenever the star, who's the star of the picture, appears for the first time, the entire audience bursts out in applause, right? So whoever it is, when they make their first appearance, it's almost like theater. Everyone gives them a big round of applause. So in my film, there wasn't quite the opportunity for that, but when Sid Grauman appears, we were in the Grauman Chinese, and everybody bursts into applause, and I realized I really found my demographic there. Where Sid Grauman gets a round of applause, it seemed like the perfect place to show it. But that was a wonderful trip because I showed the film on a Thursday in Hollywood, right on Hollywood Boulevard. And then exactly a week later, I brought it to Dawson City and showed it in the Klondike Art Center to a much smaller house, but just as enthusiastic. So to go from Hollywood to Dawson City was a great tour.
Well, this is the first film of yours I've seen. Now I have to go seek out the rest.
Okay. Well, Icarus Films has an entire box set. You can find just about everything I made for $50. So.
All right. Well, I will check that out. Well, again, thank you very much for your time, and best of luck with the film.
Oh, well, thank you. It was a pleasure talking to you, Beth.
That was Bill Morrison, director of Dawson City, Frozen Time. In an era of digital technology and on-demand viewing, we can sometimes forget the romance and magic of the physical medium of film and its power to enthrall us. Morrison's film reminds us of all that. The experience is so rooted in sound and image that words fail to capture its unique allure. All I can do is urge you to venture out and sample this delicious cinematic fever dream for yourself. And maybe then you'll fall in love with movies all over again. Coming up, I'll be talking about Hitchcock on TCM and hopefully speaking to Edgar Wright about Baby Driver. I'll also be revisiting David Cronenberg's Crash for its 20th anniversary by digging up an archive interview with the director from when the film first opened. I also urge you to check out my recent podcasts on David Lynch and queer horror coming of age. You can help support this podcast by donating at kpbs.org/feedthejunkie, or simply by going to iTunes and leaving a review. Till our next Film Fix, I'm Beth Accomando, your resident cinema junkie.
KPBS On Demand is supported by Splatero, helping homeowners pay off debt or for home improvements by offering streamlined access to your home's equity with no additional monthly payments or new debt. Splatero provides a lump sum payment in exchange for a share of your home's future value. Learn more at splatero.com.